Well, there seems to be some indication that the actions of the newly minted Biden administration is beginning to alienate union leadership. Now, this would be interesting because we've been watching in American politics over the last few years. The Democrats start to lose a bit of support with union membership. With the union rank and file, with that sort of middle class workers. And that's shifting more towards the Republicans. We saw that a little bit, I think, even, with Scott Walker in Wisconsin, because that's a very union-dominated state. He was very critical of the unions. But I think he made in his case, a bit of a calculated decision that, hey, I'm going after public sector unions. And so maybe some of these guys, who aren't necessarily teachers, or some other government employee, maybe they won't be so enraged with me. And then, in more recent times, we've had people like Trump who openly have been trying to reach out for that vote and have had a lot of success in doing so, though in no case that I know of did Trump win over union leadership, the leadership of any major trade union in this country. They all officially endorsed Biden's campaign, and that had an effect, not necessarily to boost union support for Biden, but to suppress it for Trump, because the union apparatus, which historically has been, a third-party get-out-the-vote network, was working to try and help Biden. That did not help Trump. And so perhaps the Biden team is seeing the writing on the wall and thinking, what, maybe we don't need to try and placate these people anymore, that largely the rank-and-file union members in a lot of these Midwestern states are shifting Republican over time, and that's not necessarily something that they feel like they need to fight, and so they feel like they have a little more freedom to be openly hostile to the unions themselves, including the leadership, for the sake of trying to warm up to other left of center groups, the environmentalist types. We're seeing this especially with Biden axing Keystone Pipeline. He's suspending federal permits for oil and gas exploration. There's a big story in the New York Times coming out of New Mexico, which of course was a blue state, has been for quite a long time. It was never it wasn't like one of these western states that was solid Republican and then a bunch of people moved there and it turned solid blue like Colorado. New Mexico still has a very small population, and they tend to be kind of split. They've gone back and forth between having Republican and Democratic governors, but generally speaking, when it comes to presidential elections, it's a Democratic state. Well, apparently it's also a state that's heavily dependent on the oil and gas industry, and they, as a western state, largely made up of federal lands, without, being able to drill, without being able to get new permits to drill on federal lands. Their oil and gas industry is pretty much suspended for a time. At least, new wells and things like that all have to be put on hold because they're just, their Biden team is stonewalling them. And so you've got different trades that are caught up on the wrong end of Joe Biden's economic policy. And now, even the union leaders are having to come out and condemn the administration for, taking actions which negatively affect their industries. And so what this might mean is that if the Democrats have truly forsaken, these unions and are giving them up for other constituents, then perhaps that creates an opening for not all unions, but a lot of unions maybe next time around in 4 years to switch their allegiance from the Democratic candidate, who, assuming that's Kamala Harris, to whoever the Republican candidate is, if, the Democrats kind of harden this stance of being against a lot of these industries. And if that is indeed the case, if you have stuff along the lines of the Green New Deal, certainly they're not going to do anything that crazy. But if they start trying to appeal to that kind of a voter, the Biden administration is going to alienate any of these industrial workers. Because remember, the unions are aligned with the Democratic Party, in sort of the spirit of old school workers of the world unite. Unions are, they are sort of they're the vanguard of any rising communist movement. But environmentalism and old school Bolshevism, they didn't really go together. And so the unions being a part of the Democratic coalition, at least these private sector unions that are associated with more hard scrabble industries, guys who are like welders, for example, it doesn't really fit into the modern Democratic coalition. And so if Biden is able to turn the leadership of these organizations against himself and his party, that would have a not so insignificant effect on GOP prospects in these Midwestern states, or even places like New Mexico, where these groups have a lot of influence. That union machine that typically is used to get out the vote for Democrats, although increasingly ineffectively, as time goes on and the union base becomes less and less enthusiastic about voting for Democrats, if it is in fact turned on its head and the leadership decides, okay, we are going to try and get out the vote to support Republican candidates, that could give a serious boost to Republicans in a lot of these states, and it would be enough to make up the difference in some close races. And so I think it's smart when you see people on the right coming out and talking, I'll give you an example, Ted Cruz, who is known as being not the most genuine guy, but a relatively intelligent politician, in that he knows, he knows who he's trying to appeal to. People have pointed out in recent days with what Biden has been doing, Ted Cruz's critiques kind of sound like an old school Democrat, the way that he's advocating in favor of these union workers. The Republican, quite a few Republican politicians are openly making appeals to this voting bloc, following, I guess, in Trump's lead from 2016. And I do think that there is potential for them there. It's not quite the same as, if you're trying to go as a Republican and campaign in a black neighborhood in the inner city, and the neighborhood votes 90% for the Democrats anyway, and you might scrape off an extra 2% by going to campaign there, but you also end up leaving with covered in rotten tomatoes because they don't want to hear from you. The union demographic is a little more fertile soil for attracting new voters. And of course the union leadership is very corrupt and in bed with the Democratic Party machine. But if they themselves feel personally betrayed and slighted by the Democrats, that might be enough for them, again, to switch their allegiances. Now, do you necessarily want that? Do you want corrupt union leaders in the Republicans? Because it was always a decent critique of Dems who relied on these union votes, that they were in bed with these nasty, corrupt union bosses who are not generally good people. That's a question I don't really have the answer to. I'm from Florida. We don't really have unions here except for teachers' unions. I've never known anybody that was a part of a union. I don't really understand. It's a different kind of industrial world that they live in. We don't have those kinds of industries where I am here. For the most part, everyone I've ever known has worked either for themselves or for a small business. Usually less than 20 employees, most businesses that I'm familiar with. And so, of course, every worker has a personal relationship with the boss, and they are hired, fired, and paid, all based on their own merit. And so I'm very much looking at this whole phenomenon as a disinterested third party. I am neither, one of these union workers who is trending towards the Republicans, nor am I one of these Republicans who thinks that I could appeal to these union workers, because again, they're from very different places than I live. I'm not that familiar with with them or their concerns, but I can see the opening here. And so I guess what'll be interesting is whether or not all of this is sort of forgotten by 2022, and and if Biden is able to somehow redeem himself in the eyes of these people, make them feel like he's not betraying them after all these unions endorsed him in 2020. Because if not, then we could see a pretty serious shift in a lot of these places in 2022. Perhaps if the unions really shift hard in favor of the Republicans, the governor of Michigan, could potentially be unseated. Perhaps there could be some more competitive races in the House in places like New Mexico, although I'm not particularly familiar with how they were gerrymandered there. Also, I believe there's a gubernatorial election in New Mexico in 2022. That could be very interesting. Wisconsin, I believe, also yes, because Scott Walker was elected in 2010, so that would mean that 2022 there is a gubernatorial election in Wisconsin. Obviously, Ohio, which was long been a state that has big union presence, is pretty solidly Republican, at least I should say solidly Trumpian. As long as Trump stays a big part of the Republican Party and you have more Trump-type people running in Ohio, that state should become perhaps even more red if the unions get on board, and maybe a place like Pennsylvania becomes a little less out of reach. The New Mexico buzz that there's been a lot of on Twitter since that New York Times story dropped has been, it's interesting. I think that New Mexico is going to, be electing a Republican anytime soon. I mean, that's tough to say because the kinds of Republicans that, that tend to win in New Mexico are not very Trumpy people. I mean, I think of the Republican governors in New Mexico. I mean, you've got Gary Johnson and Susana Martinez, and I know there's been, a few others in between. Obviously, Republicans, can and have been elected governor of New Mexico, but it's a matter of what kind of Republican. The Republicans that win statewide in New Mexico tend to be quite different from the kinds of Republicans who are nominated for president. And that's why, you don't see, except for George Bush kind of in, just barely in 2004 happened to win over New Mexico. So I'm not going to say that it's a state that I expect to flip in coming elections, but I think it might start to become closer structurally, as far as not just being a fluke. I think that there's a potential that that voters in New Mexico become organically more Republican in nature. So, today was a Sunday. I figured I'd do something that's a little less serious. From time to time, I like to get into political punditry to a certain extent. I think that it's way overdone, so I try not to indulge myself too much when it comes to electoral politics. But I thought that this was an interesting week, and it was a chance to discuss one aspect of the shifting political coalitions in the United States. Obviously, I mean, I'm someone who often discusses the coming collapse of the United States, as or at least of its federal institutions. So I think that discussing shifting political coalitions within the party system is kind of within that purview. It's a less extreme variant of the sort of thing that I usually cover. So I think I have a bit of an eye for it. So with that said, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.